Good evening and welcome. Bonjour, monsieur, dame. My name is Alexandre Singh, and I'm happy to welcome you here for what I call the Causeries. The people at the FIAC were very keen to call it a performance. I think a performance is stretching things a little bit. Unfortunately, I have some very bad news. We were planning to do a Causeries today on the subject of Federico Fellini, the Italian filmmaker, and his drawings. And these are some of his drawings that are up there on the projector, and some of Nina Rota's music that was piping through the speakers. Unfortunately, we had a last-minute emergency cancellation from our honoured guest. And so we thought, since you're here, and if you're willing, we will very briefly do two little things. It just so happens that yesterday we launched a book called The Causeries, which kind of explains what a causerie is. And our friend Samuel Solmaker from Découverte, who published the book, will come up with me. We'll explain a little bit about the book, what the causeries are. We'll read a little passage from it. Take about 10-15 minutes, nice and short. And then my friend Gaël, who was instrumental in helping to put the causeries together, he's an erudite young Frenchman who's in Paris, will come up and we will have a little conversation about conversation. Now, I know what you're thinking, that sounds like it's not going to go anywhere. So we will do that for around 20-25 minutes. I'm thinking about it as a sort of proto-causerie. That is to say, it's a little discussion about a discussion that we will have later. Now, I've probably been rather confusing because I've been using this word all this time. Causerie, what does it mean? Well, it just means, in French it means chat. Causer is to have an intimate little discussion that can be on topics as banal as, is the milk off? Is this person attractive? Did you hear about that soap actress? And the fact that she's sleeping with the president. And certainly matters of politics, the very low and very high, mixing together. Let me show you. This is the front cover of the book. The Causeries were a series of conversations, much like the one that's happening right now, that took place in Rotterdam around 2012 when I was invited by Wit to create a play called The Humans. They were divided into 9 major topics: creation, Victorian satire, theatrical costumes, Aristophanes, the mountain, literary sire, the voice in the chorus, Woody Allen, and eschatology. And I think the easiest way to describe exactly what they were, or what they are, is to read a little bit from the book. So I'm going to quote from Daphne's introduction. So Daphne Ayas is the director and curator of Wit, which is a contemporary art centre in Rotterdam. And she invited me to do a series of discussions or performances related to the things that I was interested in. And this is what I said. Alexandre agreed immediately, but with conditions. They at first appeared minor, but turned out to be rather important. For one, the discussions would not be called conversations, but causeries, a French word meaning a casual talk or chat. Informality and spontaneity would be the guiding words. Furthermore, round-table participants would sit around a table that was not, as per usual, rectilinear, but quite literally circular, like this one here. Their close proximity would allow them to easily hear and see each other, to make eye contact, and to communicate via all those non-verbal gestures that are so crucial to the flow of any conversation. A frown, a shake of a head, a smile, a smirk. It would be as if the public was eavesdropping on the animated ramblings of two enthusiasts. And I think the word animated, the word rambling, and enthusiasts describes the project. I would say this sounds very weird to be talking about talking. Sorry about that. The word enthusiasm is really important to me. I think we're used to... Is my mic gone away? You still hear me? Okay. In the art world, we're used to having these sort of discussions. It sounds like a big word. Someone really important comes on stage and has a recorder, asks him lots of questions, And we throw out topics about globalization, post-colonialism, Deleuze, things like that. Sometimes it feels like we're doing a homework that we don't really understand. In my preparation for the Fellini Causerie, which is not taking place this evening, but the more I delved into it, the more I thought I really had to do this. I came across very interesting things that Fellini had said, and I just wanted to go a very short paragraph. He's talking about cartoons. So Fellini was, as a young man, obsessed with the American cartoons of that era, the Cats and Jammer Kids, things like that. He grew up in Rimini, which is a town on the Adriatic, and he used to do cartoons with his friends, naked ladies. He opened a small shop with a friend of his where they would make portraits and caricatures. And that's what he went to do in Rome. And that's actually how he got his big break. He was making caricatures of the sailors and army men, the US service members who had just liberated Italy, in the shop when Rossellini came in and said to him, I'd really like you to work on a script, the script that became Rome, Open City. And cartoons and caricatures are at the heart of Fellini's passion for life and for visual culture. And when talking about them, he says, the comics were a landmark toward a type of outlook where everything took place in a fairy tale manner, and yet was perhaps more real than any other view of things, which accords a lot with his vision of the cinema. Then he says, I don't know whether official culture turned up its nose at the funnies, but generally speaking, anything that is simple, immediate, that makes you happy is looked at with suspicion, because we are prisoners of an obligatory thoughtfulness. We are overly rhetorical, and we fear things that smack of clarity. Question?
Je suis désolée. On peut avoir un petit résumé en français aussi.
Un petit résumé en français. Oui. D'accord. So, little French translation. De tout ou juste de ce passage? Je parle de Fellini, la relation entre la caricature, les cartoons, qui l'inspire, qui le nourrit énormément dans son travail, qui est un travail comme les cartoons, qui est plus que réel, qui est au-delà, qui est surprenant. C'est pas surréel, c'est surprenant. Et il dit que la culture officielle, c'est le terme qu'il utilise, a un mépris, d'une façon ou d'une autre, pour les cartoons, les BD. Il dit, on regarde avec suspicion, avec mépris, suspicion. La suspicion, parce que nous sommes des prisonniers obligatoires of thoughtfulness, de penser. Not good translation. Nous sommes trop rhétoriques, nous avons une peur pour les choses qui frappent d'être trop hilarant. Which is tous pour dire, or to say that all of these discussions about subject that are high, the creation, spontaneous generation, or low, Victorial satire, we had a discussion about South Park. They're all approached from curiosity and enthusiasm, and nothing more. There's no other layer of artiness, there's no dérivé, there's nothing more. So I guess I'm just trying to communicate that's where I'm coming from. I'd like to invite Samuel to the stage. Just to give you a sense of what a causerie has been like, and if you want, basically I'm promoting the book here, so you know how it goes. Okay, so Samuel is going to play the role of Dr. David Inglis. Dr. David Inglis is a specialist in scatology. He says as a PhD student studying scatology, one thing that really struck me was that everybody thought that doing a PhD in scatology was funny. I realized after about a year of being increasingly annoyed by this, that this was the very point of the study. Everybody thinks that it's a trivial topic. The sound of nervous laughter accompanies excreta and excretion in the modern West. We laugh nervously because there have been centuries of increasing regulation over excreta and excretion. Donc, ce passage, ça fait partie d'une causerie sur la scatologie, sur la mer. Et ce académique est en train de raconter que, quand il était étudiant, tout le monde se moquait de lui parce qu'il était Monsieur Caca. Et puis, il s'est rendu compte que c'est là l'intérêt, que tout le monde trouvait ça trivial. Qu'est-ce que c'est en français? Trivial. Okay, so Samuel is going to do some acting now.
Yes.
I will play myself. Let's begin then with the first sewerage system, the Cloaca Maxima in Rome. Oh, a bit of a link there. Construction is believed to have begun with the Etruscans around 600 BCE. It even had its own goddess, Cloacina, the goddess of discharge. I'm sure an open-minded engineer would call it a wonder of the ancient world. It was originally built as a canal, but as Rome swelled to a population of 1 million, unparalleled on Earth until the late 19th century London, the cloaca expanded from one open, informal sewer to a covered network of pipes carrying waste away from the city. As far as I understand, the Romans had public toilets. Was that normal for human beings to excrete together?
It was completely normal in ancient Rome, but not quite so across cultures.
Deuteronomy in the Old Testament says to do one's business at a distance from the campsite and bring a shovel too to cover it up. Is this something ingrained in human beings? Are we naturally clean? I guess what I'm saying is, do we naturally not like to shit in front of each other?
Well, Freud theorized that very early Homo sapiens found the smells from the genitals and anus sexually attractive. But once man evolved to walk on two legs, the anal and genital smells seemed disgusting because walking up, the air was now fresher. There's some universal degree of disgust with regard to the human waste in all societies, allowing for vast cultural differences. If the society is small, for instance hunter-gatherers in the Amazon, waste is easy to dispose of. A small number of people do not create much of a problem. As more people live closer together as a society urbanizes, a problem arises. To return to ancient Rome, compared to modern Westerners, early Romans were relatively unbothered by excrement. As Rome's population grew, the city set out a plan for waste management. Romans were upset about the amount of waste in the public, though not to the degree a modern Westerner would be. One would talk about urine and excrement in ancient Rome quite openly. The fact that there is a goddess, Cloacina, demonstrates that excreta could be discussed in the realm of popular religion. It's worth noting here, though, that Cloacina was a public goddess, not a household deity. The public toilets were such that everyone defecated inside of one another, so the toilets were sociable places, and indeed many satires describe characters that would hang around in the toilets, perhaps waiting to be invited to dinner later.
So, was this satirical because it was funny to be in the toilet?
Well, meeting acquaintances at the toilet was standard practice, but some people took it to extremes. They spent all day there, and Romans were open about excretion, but on the other hand, there was some unhappiness about the sights and smells of excreta, and the Emperor Vespasian placed a tax on using the toilets, quite a smart move, and raked in money. When one of his servants pointed out that his money came from shit and urine, Vespasian is said to have held a coin under the servant's nose and asked, "But does this smell?"
As the city of Rome evolved, so too did the idea of the countryside. There was the city and the not city. This created a duality in how excreta was managed. Waste was flushed away in the city, but in the country it was a kind of brown gold. Ordure and manure were venerated and essential to the fecundity of the earth. Human waste was used as a fertilizer in the West until the late 19th century. Aside from the fact that it carries human diseases, it is just as nutritious for the soil as cow excrement. Could you speak a little bit more about that?
I could. There is an inherent difference between urban and rural civilizations, and indeed human waste was brown gold, as you put it, until it came to be regarded as a hygienic and moral threat. The practice of using human waste as fertilizer was stamped out because people thought it would infect the food supply. Even in the times of Aristophanes, another scatologist, there was a split between how urban and rural people thought and behaved. Often in Aristophanes' plays, the lead character, a buffoon, is a rural person, not fully in control of his body's excremental capacities. Blepyrus, the hero of Ecclesias Zusai, to put it bluntly, shits all over the place. Aristophanes shocked the audience and made the point that Blepyrus is a peasant and yokel. Athenians could laugh with Blepyrus. He was a comic hero with the emphasis on hero.
So a very Trumpian character.
Yeah.
Trump, by the way, is going to be a sub-theme of the evening. Then I go on to say, I could imagine Aristophanes doing Trump. Aristophanes was sympathetic to those characters. Rabelais wrote similarly, imbuing his characters with joie de vivre and humour. Get back to the French literature. From reading the life of Gargantua and Pantagruel, we learn that Gargantua exults in pissing rivers of urine in the streets of Paris, but his son, Pantagruel, only does his business outside the city. Sense of progress. There's a sense that because Pantagruel has learned to control himself, he's more civilized.
Well, Rabelais had sympathy for his excremental characters. He celebrated the human body's capacity to excrete, but at the same time he, as a humanist scholar, made the point that a civilized creature should know how to control his capacity to shit.
Oh, there you go. Thank you very much, Samuel. I'm going to invite Joann onto the stage.
In a very complimentary fashion, that was shit.
Sorry?
In a very complimentary fashion, that was really shit.
Okay, thank you. Just here. So, since the conversation we're about to have is a conversation about conversation, I thought it might be useful to set ourselves a little time limit so that we don't overextend our welcome.
Alex knows me too well.
Yes. Now, one of the reasons that I started doing this project is that, I called it a project, is that I love conversations with my friends about these kind of topics. And these conversations, to us, are fascinating. We get to have rather erudite and not so erudite conversations on a regular basis. And Donatien, I don't know if it's the case, but Donatien's informed a lot of my work just through the conversations we've had in cafes in Paris. On the other hand, we had this very formal idea of conversational dialogue, the kind of thing we're kind of trying to do here. And I always wanted to know if it was possible that there could be some kind of middle ground, somewhere between the frisson of an animated rambling between two enthusiasts and something that's more communicable to an audience. Because after all, overhearing anyone else's conversation, it tends to sound rather asinine. So I'm going to make a little timer so that we
Okay, so
don't...
before you set up your timer, I want to say two things. One thing you haven't said, which I think is pretty important, is that, as Mallarmé once said, le monde est fait pour terminer dans un beau livre, and all these conversations that Alex put together ended up leading to a play which was performed at the Festival d'Avignon. And so everything you see ended up in a sort of Gesamtkunstwerk of sort, which was an incredible 3-hour play, which was at the Avignon Theatre Festival where Alex was still modest, even though being control freak to say it, was the artist associé 2 years ago. And then the other thing I want to say is that it is, when I was looking at this, which is something we talked about 3 years ago when both of us were babies, is, you know, I'm going to do some self-promotion myself, which is that I just did a book, which is all the talks that I did around Paul McCarthy's exhibition at the Monet Paris, which is basically, I copied your concept of the causerie, which I haven't thought about. I was looking at this, and the book is just out, and I was thinking I basically copied you. So I'm being a tribute.
Thank you very much.
Pleasure.
So the time is running, we're already a minute down.
You know, you see, he knows me too well.
Yes.
Go ahead.
So I'm thinking about this as just a little conversation that Donatien and I are having right now about a causerie that we could do about conversation.
Yeah.
That is such a huge topic. There's so much to talk about. And just earlier today we said, well, if we were to divide even conversation in intellectual history into more parts, maybe we could come up with the difference between conversation, dialogue, the causerie feuilleton, which is a namesake, and the interview, which is a very modern form. And I thought maybe I would just add little pieces as we talk. It's this puzzle. We're going to be very colonial here and begin with Western culture, the Greeks.
Who said it was colonial?
It's we're talking about this is the master narrative.
Okay.
Socrates, the dialogues. Socrates is a philosopher walking around one of the first cities that exists because we kind of have a sewer system. You know, that's what makes a city function, but you can take the shit away. And Socrates...
I really disagree with everything you said.
We're talking about the 5th century BC, end of the 5th century, the golden era of civilization there. And Socrates is famous for having created a series of dialogues that have been captured by Plato, his apt pupil.
And Xenophon.
So my question is, we understand this character, Socrates, who likes to talk to people in the agora, and then Plato formalized this. Is this correct? I mean, it's hard to say, is this correct? Am I off topic here? What was Socrates' interest? Was it to actually change people's minds in the agora, to enlighten them, or was it to, how would you say?
What I think is amazing with your whole thought process, and now you're going to think I'm going on a tangent, is you see everything from a modern point of view. You know, you were saying that Socrates was a person who believed this and that. What was his attitude? I have no idea. How can you have an idea? Well, the point of view from which we speak when we talk about Socrates is a point of view that is described in, Xenophon, Plato, and Aristophanes. And then actually what's interesting is that there are many, many mentions of Socrates as a PhD thesis that was written about that, which was recently published, which people look at all the other Socrates, which are absolutely not, that Socrates. So what you're talking about is the Socrates that ended up being the fundamental of Western culture. Is that what you're talking about? You're talking about character, not a person. Are you talking about Aristophanes' character, Socrates' Plato's character, or Xenophon's character? Pick.
I think mostly Aristophanes with a little bit of Plato.
But that's completely different, because Aristophanes is Socrates is a loser who wants to corrupt everything and who doesn't know how to behave. So you're talking. Do you think that's a real Socrates? I mean, that's the problem, because if you're talking about the dialogue as a forum, that's a political forum that was basically created. Socrates in real history was one of the sophists, so one of the people where I know the time is running. Socrates was one of the sophists, i.e., people having great students met, and actually, making money or not making money from it, sort of creating sort of following that ended up spreading all over the city and all over the power. But then, if you're talking about Plato's Socrates, who actually is a figure that is used for dialogue, that's a different question. But
then my next question is, the Academy, Plato, is dialogue and the Socratic method, the Elenkos, is that correct?
The Elenkos?
Elenkos?
It's a different story.
Wait. Is that, did instruction through question and answer continue, or do we only see that in those dialogues?
I think what's important that when you look at Plato's work, from the 390s, even though I'm not special, a bit knowledgeable about it, to the moment when the Academy becomes this really big structure, which is 380, 370 BC. Plato's texts are less and less dialogue structured. The dialogue as a thought structure is that someone who has the truth conveys who actually has access to the truth, shares it with somebody else who knows it and actually doesn't know he knows it, even rather than she. This is affect. We don't really like women. And the he can be a slave, which is interesting. But this is a beginning and has to do with this aristocratic model when people talk to each other. Then, as the Academy grows, Plato's text, which we have, the Laws, the Republic, Thucydides, all those texts are less and less dialogue driven. So you can really see that story happening in the text. That it's more and more a voice rather than a dialogue. But as actually Plato once said, thought is the soul which silently having a dialogue with itself.
Thought is that, is a conversation with yourself.
The soul, that is not yourself.
The soul.
You see, you're being modern. You're being modern again.
You're being modern
again. Because you're saying you are having a dialogue with yourself.
Yes.
The soul is different. So you're not the soul. The soul is a part of you. You see.
Then you're speaking poetically.
I'm speaking like an ancient person.
But I'm going to try and segue here like a radio show. We might think about the essay. So the way that people express themselves intellectually now quite often is through books,
Yeah.
and books that are not fiction tend to be essays of a sort, and they have antecedents throughout history. One of them might be Montaigne, Michel de Montaigne. And he, in a sense, is having a dialogue with himself because he's writing little passages with his thoughts about this ancient Roman author, and how does that apply to what he thinks today about society then? And the topics can be, how should you raise your son? Or it can be what to do if you have too many erections. And he sort of treats both topics with the same seriousness, in a sense. And then you find in his writing that he corrects himself. He comes back years later and he writes a new passage and he says, oh, actually, now I have a new idea about this.
Yeah.
In a sense, maybe that.
But I think the reason why Montaigne is so important, it really is a turning point between the idea of of the self as a stage and the self as an individual. And what struck me when I was listening to you and I was rethinking about the Causeries is that you're actually thinking of the self as a person. You said Socrates, Montaigne, he. But up until Montaigne, the self was rather a field. In a way, what's interesting is that in tragedy, when we think about tragedy, it's never, someone is never raged. Rage possesses someone. So
ancient Greek tragedy.
Ancient Greek tragedy, even Seneca, and actually, after the great tension in Racine is really that: is it this person doing this and that, doing this or that sin or whatever, or is it actually that sin possessing the person? Responsibility.
Or the gods.
Or the gods, or yes. God, or fury, or whatever.
Fate, as it were.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, as Seneca would say, because I think we're doing too much English for French plays, we need to do Latin too. Via lenta fata, and holitus mobis remor. Mactesque, et pestis, and habitus dolor. Me comite, me cum, ducibus his utilibe, which are the three last verses of Seneca's Oedipus, which is basically calling on these great powers, fate, rage, to come with him. So he himself is not responsible. They have taken him. Hence, Oedipus, the murder of the father, etc.
Okay, I'm going to shift 1,000 years to England and France.
England is more your thing than mine.
It's more my thing. Two cultural phenomena. I began by talking about sitting in a restaurant or a Parisian cafe and having a chat around, what's the name of this kind of table? Guéridon. The coffee house arrives in the 15th, 16th century in Britain, and coffee becomes this drug that people go to public houses to consume and have animated conversations, and it nourishes in some sense, it leads up to the British age, Golden Age of philosophy, the Scottish Enlightenment, lots of political changes, the Whigs organised in coffee shops. And then in France, you have this different idea about conversation.
The same thing happened in France in the 18th century. The café were very important in the revolutionary culture. 1780s, 1780s leading to the revolution. So it's not, they're similar. You have to remember that the French at the beginning of the 18th century dreamt of being English. Not that much now. But
what do they dream of now?
Tell you, French.
Being American.
The Italians do.
The Italians do.
That great Remerciements phrase which says, le français se reproche tous les vices sauf le pire, la paresse de penser. I think it's quite good. Not sure if it's true, but it's quite good.
I want to talk about the salons. Donatien, you know a lot about many different topics, especially the ancient world, but something you have to know a lot about is 19th century, late 19th century France. In France, you have this fascinating cultural phenomenon that begins in the 16th century and really becomes very important in the 17th century, which is the salons, which I think everyone here knows what I'm talking about. These are gatherings of aristocratic people, but always hosted by women. It's one of the most significant early contributions, where women are not just contributing to a male sphere, but dominating it and allowing for a completely different type of intellectual discourse that didn't exist before. And so I'm not very...
one thing that I was recently I want to say two things. First of all, what you have to understand that these conversations are a way for Alex to do his own work, in a fun way with people. Because all that end up, feeding your work actually. So we're basically feeding your data research. But one thing I was thinking about, I was very interested in recently, that probably all of you, or many of you, and if you don't go to the Louvre, know the beautiful portrait of Madame Récamier by David. She was this extraordinarily prestigious figure at the late 18th and 19th century, during the Directoire, and then during the beginning of the Empire, and she was Napoleon's Empire. And what was extraordinary about her is that she really had the greatest salon, and she was extraordinarily beautiful, and she was portrayed throughout history as this, the 1800s, 1810s, late 1810s, early 1820s, she was 50, so she started hiding from the world. It was extremely beautiful, and she was 40 something. And she was the most powerful intellectual figure in the world, in the French world, and therefore at the time in the world. And she was completely, and what was interesting is that I was wondering, as opposed to Madame de Staël, who famously had many lovers, she was considered and seen to be not to have a sexuality. So she actually had a couple lovers, but it was never public, as opposed to a great love with Chateaubriand, but there was never really, she was never the great lover of Chateaubriand with so many lovers. So I was thinking it's interesting because you have that woman dominate, and you have really those two poles. A woman who has
Could you just describe very briefly what kind of things would be discussed? What kind of things would be discussed at these salons, beginning in the 17th century?
Well, I think it's everything and nothing. I mean, what's interesting about the spaces is that, from what I know, there were places in which there was no momentum on things, which is interesting. You could talk about literature, you could talk about politics. That could lead into, some people say that the revolution was born in the salon. Even though, which is interesting, because the revolution was never, by the way, a democratic thing. It was done by the elites. People were oppressed with it, actually. But what was interesting that you could have, there was an order, there was an aristocracy, it was sort of system, but there was no, from what I see, and from the great book of Marret, which Marret is legendary French scholar who's written the most important books about it, there was no moment. That's also the moment when fashion was invented.
Oh, but was there anything that was taboo? Because I understand that social etiquette and social propriety became very important.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is that, the realm of literature, the realm of politics, the realm of knowledge, everything had to do with l'esprit, la diplomatie de l'esprit.
So l'esprit you would describe as?
Wit.
Wit.
Wit and intelligence.
Yes.
The great thing with French is that l'esprit means spirit and wit at the same time. The great book about this, book by Marret, which is called La diplomatie de l'esprit, and the idea of a disparity of wit and spirit is really interesting because diplomacy obviously has to do with politics. L'esprit, not really. And that's a tension. It is a diplomatie de l'esprit. There's a politics inside, there's a politics outside, and governing it all is wit. L'esprit, better than wit.
By the 19th century, we find that it's not just aristocratic women that are having salons, we have the bourgeoisie. In Marcel Proust's Recherche du temps perdu, there's a famous rivalry, isn't there, between Madame Verdurin and, is it with the Duchesse de Gaulle?
No, she becomes the Duchesse de Gaulle.
She becomes her eventually. But there's these sort of many different salons happening.
Actually, there's no rivalry because she wouldn't be able to compete. I mean, the whole story of It's Such a Lost Time is a person who was not able to compete with the Duchesse becoming the Duchesse, which is tragedy. Levinas once said, we had a joke with Alex, a private joke, and he said, don't quote Levinas at the beginning of the talk or everybody's going to fall asleep. But actually, you began with scatology, which was even worse. So Levinas once said, à la recherche du temps perdu is une aristocratie sans Versailles. And I just think it's the best sentence about this. It's a world which is aristocratic, which is governed by a nobility, and it has lost its necessity. But I wanted to ask you a question, because I've never asked you that question. I am very interested in Sainte-Beuve. And Sainte-Beuve, absolute bestseller, which shaped 19th century ideology, is the Causeries du Lundi, which were published in the Constitutionnel.
Can you describe what they are?
Yes, but I want to ask you a question.
No, first describe, because we don't all know what the Causeries
The Causeries du Lundi were published every Monday, as it says, and there were...
Where? Which?
I just said it in the Constitutionnel, and so, and then in another publication. But the thing about this conversation...
Were they?
Sorry?
No, you have to describe them. Sorry.
I get it. And then don't worry, then I will help you even better. When it's in England, it affects the Pythonish, because there are some Germans around us. And so, even though you're not really English. But anyway, what I was saying is that on these conversations, basically they're the birth of what is now called cultural criticism. You could talk about anything. So you could talk about history, you could talk about Flaubert, you could talk about Fromentin, you could talk about Balzac, you could talk about Henri IV, you could talk about anything. And they shaped cultural criticism. And Nietzsche, for instance, saw this as the birth of l'esprit français. After Voltaire, there was Sainte-Beuve. And so the whole idea of cultural criticism, which is so prevalent in America, the New Yorker and the New York Review and the whole thing, came from Sainte-Beuve.
So what about the term? Because he calls them causeries.
That's what I wanted to
It
ask.
sounds humoristic. It sounds
No,
like,
it's not.
like more endowed.
But I think your notion of causerie, I don't completely agree with your notion of causerie.
But can you just describe the tone in
I will. But the causerie are, the idea that the causerie is not just two people having a chit chat. It's one person addressing another.
Or the whole public.
Yeah, exactly.
Everyone who reads newspapers.
Exactly. So it's someone who's doing a causerie. So it's familiar, but it's also addressing someone. So I want to ask you a question because then you're going to push me into asking me other questions. Were you thinking of Sainte-Beuve when you titled this causerie?
No, I was really thinking about the word.
It's a funny thing, because in French literary history, when we say causerie, it really means Sainte-Beuve.
Really?
Yeah, because for instance, in Proust,
yes.
There's this great moment when he says, les vrais livres sont les enfants, non du grand jour et de la causerie, mais de l'obscurité et du silence. And that phrase is completely coded, because grand jour is the salon, so it's open air, it's public, and causerie is Sainte-Beuve, and obscurité and silence, obscurity and silence, is the other side, instead of poetry. So I was thinking that you might have thought about it, and that's why I was so excited with, Alex's project. I thought, here's a contemporary artist reading Sainte-Beuve. Amazing.
Well, it's not the case.
Have you read Sainte-Beuve since?
No, but
Why did I read a book
I'm
about it?
waiting for the
Friends are terrible. I wrote a book about it. My friend hasn't read it.
Okay, so that brings us, we're racing through time. So how long do we have left? Hang on.
You see, the problem with Alex is that he's a nerd in the Warholian age. We could have spoken for an hour, 2 hours, and I'm sure you would have all remained. Very optimistic.
Hang on. So let me segue immediately from Sainte-Beuve to the causerie, the feuilleton, the age of the newspaper.
But that's the same
the idea
thing.
of the conversation.
That's the same thing, because the age of the newspaper was born in the 19th century. I mean, you had this great joke about Alexandre Dumas saying that, because they were paid by the line. So he would go, do à la ligne, s'écria-t-il en espagnol. 2 lines. And obviously, is in Spanish by definition. And so, but I think, what made Sainte-Beuve so influential is that the causeries were published in the mass press. They were widely disseminated, and everybody in Europe would read them. So, in a way, they were spreading. Well, the reason why Sainte-Beuve is so admirable is because he managed to do something which is extremely informed, intelligent. He was very knowledgeable, and he had a point of view on things, even though he thought that Flaubert, Salammbô was much better than Madame Bovary. Some would disagree, even though. And
so let's move on from the.
And then what's interesting about that he was doing that in the mass press. So he was spreading knowledge to a much wider audience while still having a point of view. So in a way, I'm sure all of you are on YouTube, and there's been a very interesting phenomenon, which is Henri Guillemin. Henri Guillemin was a very important historian in the 60s, 70s, literary historian. And what's interesting is that he would do these things on French TV and Swiss TV. Actually, never French. The French never liked him, even though he was French. Belgian TV, Swiss TV. And now, they're on YouTube. So I'm getting to your point of view, which is interview and everything. And they're on YouTube. And there are people, if you go on YouTube and watch Henri Guillemin, first of all, it's fantastic. But then, 15,000 people, 20,000 people, 40,000 people watch it on YouTube, which is very interesting as to what it says about disseminating knowledge, which is what Sainte-Beuve did.
So from the mass press, I'd like to come to our last type of discussion, or conversation, which is the modern interview, which I can't think of. I don't know what would be the earliest examples of. I couldn't say for sure what it grows out of.
Well, you know, in a way.
If I was to say, if I think about the apogee of interview, I would think of Interview magazine. Andy Warhol, someone who's obsessed with the banalities of celebrities' lives. This is sort of the ultimate.
Yeah, but no, because you know, in an interesting way, in the late 19th century, immediately after the feuilleton and Saint-Beuve Causeries come to interview, you know, there's a lot, there's tens of interviews in the press, but there are many articles.
Where he's being interviewed, or
he's being interviewed
by
a journalist.
Yeah.
As today.
Right.
You know, and even a really interesting thing in art history is about Paul Cézanne and Gauguin. Cézanne and Gauguin famously hated each other, and Cézanne was never, after he turned 20, never wrote again. Never wrote. You can't find a text by Cézanne. But he would do interviews. And there's a very, very beautiful book published by Macula, advertising for others, Entretien avec Paul Cézanne or something like that. And Gauguin would never do that. And the interview became a way of performing the self indirectly, which is what you're doing now. You're interviewing us, but you're performing the self.
Yes. So just to conclude, are interviews conversations? Does the circle loop around? Probably not. You'd say it's a very stylized performance.
Yeah, but I think
because you were saying something very interesting the other day. You were talking about a good friend of yours, Kim Kardashian.
She's not a good friend of mine.
Okay.
I
did say something very interesting.
No, I was. You know, it's trapping me. You know, I remember once. It so happened that from time to time, I mean, this is you know, as a journalist, you would be spanked for that. You don't talk about the private conversation in public.
Okay.
You know, you shouldn't do that. It's like I was once doing a radio show, and I happened to be working with I have the great fortune, the great honor of working with Azzedine Olaya, and I mentioned a conversation I had with him to the journalist. And the journalist was a better professional than you, I'm afraid, Alex, but he didn't have the fortune of being an artist. Was telling me, because it so happened that, you know, I bought a book about Nero and he had a connection to Nero. So that's a different story. And I mentioned it to the journalist when he was interviewing me about Nero. And then he sort of pushed me and said during the interview, which is on France Inter, you know, but maybe there was a story there about that thing, and obviously he wanted me to talk about Olaya. And I didn't do it because, and you just did that.
I just wanted to make a nice little segue.
Well, I know you wanted to be pop.
You made
didn't
great.
work. But going back to that, what I was saying about Kim Kardashian, what I think is very interesting about her and why she stands as a sort of metaphor for a great interview, and I've done a number of them, is that she's completely present and completely absent. And actually, that's what she told me. When she is everywhere, you know, her image, and yet as a person, she's nowhere. So she's completely present and completely absent. And in a way, you know, in my experience doing interviews, which is exactly what you're doing, and you're doing it at the best, you're turning it into an art form because you're making yourself, you can see, completely absent, and yet you're obviously completely present because you're directing it, and that's what makes this causerie really interesting by the book. In a great interview, you have to be completely there and completely handling the thing and letting everything happen. And so we go back to the beginning of our conversation, you know, the self, modern self. You know, you are, which is what you were saying at the beginning. Does Socrates do this? Or do things happen, and you set yourself as a stage. And I think a great interview is setting yourself as a stage for things to happen.
I think that's very interesting. I think though you have a sort of deep theme that could underpin. So if we had a series of in-depth discussions with academics, we could go through the history of conversation, Socrates, we could look at the salons, we could have another one on Saint-Beuve. But I think throughout, the deeper philosophical idea would be the notion of the self.
Yeah,
the individual, what is the individual,
exactly.
And what do we mean by his
But I think that's why I think after being such a bore with you for half an hour, I'm going to pay tribute. You know, I think that's what makes your work really amazing. I was very fortunate to follow the humans. I mean, all the causerie led into the humans, which is this amazing sort of Gesamtkunstwerk play. And I performed in New York, and I was just amazed, at the courage of creating a stage for which, you're going to tackle on the creation of the world, just that. And I think what I thought was very courageous about this and what I think I'm interested in personally, and I think that has to do with the interview. And then I'll go into one more tangent, and then you can talk one more. And then is the idea of the interview not just being two people having a conversation published in a magazine, but actually being an interaction, a real human interaction.
Yes.
And therefore, you can say, and that's what I was thinking.
That leads to the creation of new knowledge.
And that leads to...
It sounds very pretentious, but
I was thinking,
a new idea.
But I'll go to pretentious in a second.
Okay.
But the thing about Kim Kardashian, the reason why I think she's so admirable, is that she's having an interview with the world. It's insane. In a way, you could say it's really futile. It's completely futile. But she's having an interview with the world. And I think that metaphysically, and then you can relate it to them and to everything, but that's what she does. And I think about being pretentious. I think that pretentious is not, in French we say être prétentieux and avoir des prétentions. I think it's good to have pretenses. Being pretentious is not interesting, but the border between being pretentious and having pretenses is very thin. But when you have pretenses, sometimes you come across as pretentious, and probably we did. But the important thing is to have pretenses. And so I think that what has made your work really interesting for me, following it as a friend, but also as a fan and a supporter, is that you have pretenses. So don't let him fool you. He's not pretentious, he has pretenses.
Well, thank you very much. So I think at this moment in our cafe conversation, the waiter would arrive, you'd have to say you have to go to a meeting, and then if you happen to have been eavesdropping, you draw your own conclusions. But I'd like to thank you for listening in on our very meandering conversation, and that's what we're going to thank you very much, Donatien.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you very much.